Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and today this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Today, I'd like to talk to you about fatalism, determinism, the difference between the two if there is one, the importance of how we define words, and what I would personally like to coin as the Stoned Philosopher Fallacy. Let me first go ahead and say that I have no hard feelings towards the Stoned Philosopher, a YouTuber who I have been debating at some length on Twitter. While we don't agree on much, and he can certainly be frustrating at times, overall and thus far, I like the guy. So, I mean no disrespect to name a fallacy after him, but after the conversation that we've had, it is just too fitting not. So, to start, since it was the order that I gave the video, a few words about fatalism, determinism, a mistake that I recently made on the subject, and the differences between the two. Now, as I currently understand it, determinism is a subset of fatalism. I had known the definitions of the two for the most part. I had the two reversed as to which was a subset of the other and which one involved a element of human choice. Not necessarily human choice, but in which humans existed outside the system of determinism, so to speak. So, if you Google the difference between fatalism and determinism, the results seem to have consensus. That's what I'm going with. I do know that there's some debate in the community, as the Stoned Philosopher considers himself to be a determinist, which would make him in some ways more of an expert on the subject than I. However, I just can't find too much backing up his definitions on the matter. So, fatalism is, well, let's start with determinism. Determinism is the belief that, not that everything is predetermined, but that everything is determined. A distinction I've been having trouble with. So, the idea is that between your genetics and your surroundings, data feeds into you like you would feed data into a computer. And when you feed data into a computer, it has no option but to react the way that you told it to. You similarly are just a functioning biological computer which data is being fed into and interacting on you. This means that there is no free will whatsoever. Now, I certainly believe that there are limits on free will and that it is not as ultimate an idea as some people believe, but I definitely believe in the concept of free will. That being said, the idea that many things in life are determined is very scientifically plausible. The problem I have sometimes with determinists is that they don't take it to the logical conclusion of predetermination. See, they believe that everything that happens in life is determined by events that were set in motion before your birth. But soft determinists, like the Stoned Philosopher, believe that there is an element of choice in the matter, simply because when random events happen outside of your control, they change the data in your input. So you wouldn't have otherwise experienced this if it wasn't for a random event outside of your control. What I can't seem to get across to them is that those random events aren't random. By the idea of determinism, they would have still been predetermined by other events, or determined by other events, which had taken place in the past, and thus have already been determined to happen to you because of these other events. So, the so-called changes that he sees aren't there. Determinism is essentially fate. Now, if you Google fate, the first definition mentions something about supernatural beings. Almost every other definition that you can find, however, in, say, a dictionary, will show you that fate is when your life has been determined, when you cannot change the outcome of what happens. Basically, when you have no free will or no choice of your own. AKA, when everything is determined before you've made any sort of decision yourself. Now, fatalists believe what the Stoned Philosopher believes. He is actually a fatalist. He considers himself to be a determinist because, like me until recently, he had the definitions flipped. He still does. So, determinists believe that everything is determined and that anything you do has no choice in the matter. Fatalists, on the other hand, and this is where it gets confusing because by the way the two terms sound, I would think this should be switched, but fatalists believe that humans exist outside of that system. So everything around you, everything else is predetermined, pre-coursed. You can't change any of the random factors that will influence you, but you do have decisions. You exist outside of this system as a human, and so you can make choices, but the choices don't affect anything. The end result for a fatalist is always the same, and not just that you always die, but the end results of everything, because you've no change, or you've no influence over other events which are already predetermined to happen. It gets very confusing for anyone who, believes in the concept of free will, but as I understand it, the Stoned Philosopher considers himself to be a soft determinist, whereas I would call him a soft fatalist with my current understanding of the definition of the terms. This brings us to the importance of how we define terms, because in my discussions with the Stoned Philosopher, this has probably been what we've spent the most time on. See, he's not a fan of dictionary definitions. He thinks that words need to be philosophically defined, and that, because words and language are fluid, a dictionary definition, which is a concrete definition, can never be accurate because we all view these subjectively. I don't think that we view definitions subjectively if all of the words in the definition mean the same thing. It's only when we start choosing some words and using our own definitions for them that language becomes subjective, which makes it, in my opinion, very difficult to communicate. After some length, I asked him several questions of how we could get around this. His solution was that two people can't really converse even if they know the same language, because they have their own subjective ideas for every word. They can't really converse unless, between the two of them, they define every word. So I started with A, and he very quickly got tired of this and called me intellectually dishonest for attempting to define every word with me, saying that, okay, no, it's not every word, it's only the words that you have a problem with. So if you don't understand the other person's definition, you should ask them their definition, and then the two of you can discuss a definition and come to a cohesive term to use. Which I asked how I would know which words he wasn't using properly, because see, I used the dictionary definition, which I consider to be using language properly. But I would have no way of knowing which words he was using his own subjective definition of, or Sam Harris's definition in the case of determinism and fatalism, it sounds like. And so he never got back to me on that, on how I would be able to figure out which words to actually ask him to define for me so that we could argue about the definition of these words, come to a conclusion on how to use these words, and then move forward in the conversation. Or we could use the words as they're laid out in the dictionary, which he just absolutely refuses to do, despite agreeing with a tweet I pointed him to, which states that the way that we use words in communication is important. I can't remember the exact tweet. It was a little bit more than that. But regardless, I think it's very important to, whether or not we use the dictionary definitions, because I get it, words change. Sometimes there are socially accepted definitions. He wasn't really a fan of using those either. So no dictionary definitions, no Google definitions, no socially accepted definitions. When we have a problem with how a word's defined, every two individuals, need to sort out the definition between the two of them. In my opinion, this would make language and proper communication absolutely impossible. It is, I think, a ridiculous thing to ask another person to do, which I kind of tried to point out to him how ridiculous this was by starting the process of defining words with him. We didn't make it past A, which, by the way, Stoned Philosopher says, and will claim up and down, is not a word. A is a letter, it's not a word, according to Stoned Philosopher. He doesn't seem to understand the concept that it can be both, just like he doesn't seem to understand the concept of multiple definitions of words and that determinism is essentially fate. He believes that fate has to have a supernatural aspect to it because one definition stated, well, actually two, but he only found one definition that stated that it had to have a supernatural aspect to it. So, if you come across someone who refuses to use words in the dictionary and refuses to use words as they're socially defined and wants to define every word along with you, I think you found the Stoned Philosopher, because I just can't imagine there are too many other people out there with this philosophy who are as successful at communicating as he still honestly manages to be. I've pretty much given up on asking him to define words and assume, for the most part, that he's using dictionary definitions, because it turns out, despite our first few interactions leading me to believe otherwise, that for the most part, he is. But when we have a miscommunication, I immediately, based on my experience with him, assume that it is because he is not using a word as defined in the dictionary, and then until I figured out what word it is that he's using improperly, we probably can't move forward with the conversation. So I'm curious if there are other people out there. Let me know if you believe that language should be purely subjective and that people as individuals should discuss the definition of words between the two of them before moving forward in any conversation, or if you would like to keep efficiently using language the way that we've all essentially agreed to and continue using Google and dictionary definitions. Personally, that's what I will be doing. Now let's see here. I do remember that I had 3 topics at the beginning of this video. We had fatalism and soft determinism. We had the one that I just went over. What was the third? Oh, right! The Stoned Philosopher Fallacy. Can you guess what it is? Now, again, this is meant to be in playful jest, and I don't honestly think that he'll mind if it takes off. However, the Stoned Philosopher Fallacy is when someone is using their own subjective, made-up definition of a word in order to get an edge in an argument, rather than using dictionary definitions, socially agreed upon definitions, or anything that you can find on Google. No. They make one up on the spot, because if you can't move forward with their philosophical, subjective interpretation of language, well, then you're just not as forward-thinking and as intelligent or learned a person as they are. Because Stoned Philosopher has figured out, I think, that I do not have a college degree. And he does. Now, I don't think he would like being called elitist, but it is the first word that comes to my mind whenever he brings up his formal education. Now, one last thing while we're on the topic of my new, hopefully, friend. In my video, Why is Black History Month Racist? In the comments below, me and him have gone into quite the discussion. If you get involved, please be respectful, no dogpiling. I don't care whether you take my side or his, but I would love for more voices to get involved because it's really becoming a great conversation, as, again, frustrating as it can be at times. Well, it looks like that's about all the time that I want to spend on this video, but thanks again for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I don't know why it's important, but I keep hearing about it, so if you really like my videos, go ahead and ring that notification bell as well. Anyway, once again, thanks for joining us. I'm Lewis Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club.